So welcome, my name is Roberta Kowald, and this is the Asian Pacific Islanders section of the presentation I'm Not There, Racial Stereotypes and Racial Absence in Media. So the first thing we need to recognize is that there's persistent Asian stereotypes that show up in a lot of movies, television, print, internet memes, and they tend to fall into the same categories. So one of them is the eternal sidekick. The Asian men are almost never the romantic interest. They're almost never the protagonist, the main protagonist in a story. Asian men don't get to kiss the girl or anyone else. They're often portrayed as extremely sexless, never really integrate. Think about the characters in Lost. You have a female character who can barely speak English. You have two characters who can only communicate with each other. So while they've both been living in the United States for a significant amount of time, there's also this idea that, well, they're not really one of us. They never really become part of our community. Asian Pacific Islander females are often invariably prostitutes or sort of geisha characters whose entire existence is to take care of men. Often the persistent Asian stereotype is being wealthy and well-educated and the model minority. And these three go together. And if actually these last three, wealthy, well-educated, and model minority, have actually gone on to become really problematic for the APIA community in terms of getting resources. We'll talk about that in a minute. So you see this kind of thing on the internet quite a lot. This persistent repetition of images that APIA languages are a bunch of gibberish, and that's really cute and funny, and you can just say a lot of hilarious sounds that have ing and ong in them, and suddenly that sounds just like an APIA language. Or this image of the harsh parental unit who is only about you getting A's and doesn't care about anything about you as a person. And we're going to talk about that when it comes to Tiger Moms in a minute. And I find these images really interesting. These are about Jeremy Lin, the basketball player. And I'll tell you, the one in the top left-hand corner that says the Knicks' good fortune, that actually showed up on CNN, or sorry, ESPN. ESPN as the background to a story on Jeremy Lin. He does the math to win because he couldn't possibly be good at sports because Asian Pacific Islander men, particularly, they're not good at sports. They're good at math. They're good at science. Or in the Bruce Lin one, they're goofy kung fu masters. Or probably the worst one, which is the one in the bottom right-hand corner, which is that Jeremy Lin isn't really a basketball player at all. He's Michael Jordan in an Asian suit. So he's basically Michael Jordan in Asian drag. So these are very interesting, these perpetual stereotypes that Asian men are not good at sports, they're only good at science things, and they're kind of nerdy. So let's talk about Tiger Moms. This is interesting. This became this huge phenomenon. And on the one hand, this is why Asians are better than us at everything in the United States. But it also became a way to perpetuate the stereotype that Asian parenting is done somehow magically differently than American parenting. In actual fact, most Chinese parents do not subscribe to the Tiger Mom parenting style. He, in 2011, did a very extensive study with interviews and spent time in China examining how Chinese parents parented, and found that this Tiger Mom stereotype, not only do Chinese parents not actually do this, but they don't believe that this model fosters the best, the most successful children. So they don't even think that the Tiger Mom model is a good model. And in reality, just like any parenting, if you said, well, all white American parents parent this way, people would object and say, no, we don't. That's not how we do things. So in reality, not unexpectedly, Chinese parents parent various ways, lots of different ways, wide range of strategies and beliefs and tactics. But this idea that all Chinese parents parent in this manner has become, again, part of that stereotype, that old stereotype of the harsh parent. You must get A's, you must take violin lessons, you must do this, succeed at any cost, is again part of this stereotypical idea of who the Asian Pacific Islander community is. So that's the presence. Let's talk about when there's no presence. So one of them is the invisibility factor. There's not been a show featuring a primary cast of API characters since Margaret Cho's All American Girl in 1994, which I'm now old enough to realize that was almost 30 years ago. So it's been a long time. Ever since then, you have seen only API characters in bit parts, ensemble casts, or absent completely. And I will point out that, All American Girl was supposed to be this big stride toward inclusion of the APIA community and APIA invisibility. But I'll also point out it's an interesting example of this interchangeable idea of the Asian character. So the storyline is Margaret Cho and as a young Korean American woman and her Korean American family. In actual fact, none of her family members are actually Korean. The guy who plays her brother is Chinese. The woman who plays her mother is Japanese. The man who played her father is also Japanese. The only Korean person in the entire show is Margaret Cho herself. So again, this idea that all Asiatic cultures and all Asian Pacific Islander communities are interchangeable. Yeah, you can just put some Japanese people in there and Americans will buy them as being a Korean family. We also have this thing where how Asian characters interact with other characters is kind of interesting. And I'll point out, television land, they count the Mindy Project as a big stride for Asian Pacific Islanders on television. I'm not sure I would consider An American Girl who went to a Ivy League school as an example of an Asian Pacific Islander. They do count people from India still in that category in television land. So it's interesting because, Mindy lives in a world that is predominantly white. She only dates white men. There's no other Indian Americans in the show. And there's not even any references to her background. There's one scene in the pilot where she is shown a flashback to her childhood in India. But that's it. That's all we ever see. So she's present, but she's divorced from her entire community. And let's talk about Elementary, which is, if you're not familiar with it, it's the Americanized version. It's sort of the American version of Sherlock, which is the British show Sherlock, which is the modernization of the Sherlock Holmes stories. Elementary is really interesting. Again, seriously problematic because you've got Lucy Liu, who is a strong character, but she's essentially a geisha. I mean, this is her opening dialogue in episode 1 is, "I've been hired by your father to be your sober companion." And she actually gives up being a surgeon to become Sherlock's companion. Now the storyline has changed and she is his apprentice and he's teaching her the ways because he's the master and she's learning how to do this. But she lives with him and she's still taking care of him, which is very different when you compare it to the British Sherlock. We've got Lucy Liu, who is the companion, there's this sort of sexual vibe going on between these two. In John Watson, in the British show Sherlock, there's lots of jokes about the fact that people think that they're partnered and that they're gay, but in actual fact, it's presented as a joke. That, no, we're not gay, we're both straight. In fact, John gets married in season 3. And so it's very interesting that, this is the Americanized version, which has an Asian woman who is his companion in a very, very different way. And the dynamic between her and Sherlock in Elementary is very different between Sherlock and John Watson in the British show Sherlock. So let's talk about Glee again. Glee is incredibly bizarre about this. These two characters are incredibly weird. They literally met at what they refer to as Asian camp. They seem to think that if they put the word Asian in front of every single word, then that's funny. These two characters refer to each other as Asian and other Asian. When they kiss, they call them Asian kisses, and I swear it's true, they actually do call them that. When they get B's, they call their grades Asian F's. They both have the same last name. Oh, isn't that cute? Because all Asian people have the same names. When their relationship gets difficult, they actually go to something that is referred to as Asian counseling. The other part of absence, too, is when you have these communities where large proportions of APIA characters exist, API people live, but they're not ever shown. So San Francisco has almost 34% APIA community. No show set in San Francisco has a single APIA regular character. Law and Order SVU, which is set in New York, which is about 10% APIA, has one API regular character. King of Queens really should know better. King of Queens has no APIA community in it at all. So here's these people who live on the street. They have no APIA neighbors. They have no friends. You never see APIA in the street scenes. They're never in the background. They're never in the cafe. This is kind of the APIA version of what we call the Friends problem, which is when Friends got in trouble for being in New York, having these people live in New York where apparently there were no black people or anybody of color. So it's interesting. So, King of Queens should know better. So the other thing that often frequently happens with APIA community folks is these blinded by what we call whitewashing, where they're casting white actors and actresses to play API characters, or simply reframing the entire storyline, replacing all the characters with white characters. And this has been a long Hollywood tradition. The Seven Samurai is probably the most egregious example, where you have Akira Kurosawa's amazing film, The Seven Samurai, goes to American audiences, gets turned into The Magnificent Seven. A more recent aspect of this is The Last Airbender. Oh, and I will also point out Yul Brynner, who the Academy Awards people still consider a win for the APIA community, even though he was actually Russian and was born in Mongolia. Apparently that makes you Asian. So, and that's him in The King and I, not even remotely Asian. And the other one was The Last Airbender, which was a movie based on the Nickelodeon series. And I will point out, filmed by M. Night Shyamalan, who also should know better. In this case, look at the casting call for this. We're looking for boys aged 12 to 15, Caucasian or other ethnicity. It's very interesting. They did not even offer these parts to anybody who was APIA, even though there were a number of. This is to play a character named Ang in a sort of mythical Asiatic land. And it's happening right now. Right now, if you've seen the trailers for the movie Edge of Tomorrow with Tom Cruise, it's actually based on a very brilliant and very popular science fiction novel written in 2012, Hiroshi Sakurazaka's All You Need Is Kill. Fascinating storyline, fascinating information. Ends up becoming Edge of Tomorrow, starring Tom Cruise and an all-white cast. I will also point out it's supposed to be a guy who's in an international squad of people from all around the world. Everyone else kept their foreign-sounding names, except for Tom Cruise, and his name gets changed to Major William Cage. The other one that's happening right now is the fight going on about Akira. It was written in 2000, that should be 2010. Classic manga and anime. If you're familiar with manga and anime, this is a really important piece of work. In 2012, what they did was they took it and tried to retool it. It's been getting a lot of flack. It's still set in Neo-Manhattan instead of Neo-Tokyo. They kept the Japanese names of the main characters, which is Tetsuya and Kaneda. Despite this, the script's only been sent to Robert Pattinson, Justin Timberlake, and Garrett Hedlund. No Japanese or API characters have been cast or even approached. Except if you're a kung fu master, and then this gets interesting. Right now there's a debate going on the blogosphere about Iron Fist, the superhero. In the comic books, Iron Fist is not an APIA character. He is a white guy who was raised in a mystical city and becomes a martial arts master. But they've been talking about whether or not Iron Fist we should get an Asian guy because it's kung fu. That's why we should have that. So it's very interesting. So Akira, which is a post-apocalyptic story about nuclear holocaust and the aftermath, gets turned into white guys. A white guy gets turned into an Asian guy because he's a karate master. So what impact does this actually have on communities? It's just television. Well, it's not. One of the problems is that this persistent belief that Asians are the model minority and have lower rates of poverty means less resources going to these communities. Probably the worst example of this was a Pew study that proclaimed that the API community has low poverty rates, completely ignoring the vast socioeconomic differences and disparities among ethnicities and dialects that exist among the APIA groups.